Hi, welcome to this new podcast on MFN and IRA. So, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you've probably heard a lot of acronyms flying around lately. MFN, IRA, then Globe, God, and Generous models. And if you're wondering what all of this actually means for you and for drug pricing in America, you're not alone. So, I'm Dr. Hari Trivikramji. I run AGL Life. We are a consulting company focused on pharmaceuticals and biotechnology companies. We are essentially a strategy consulting outfit. So let me break down how these two big forces, MFN and IRA, is reshaping pharmaceutical pricing in the US currently. So MFN is the most favored nation pricing policy, and IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll try to explain how they work, how they interact, and most importantly, what they mean if you're a pharma company trying to bring drugs to the American market. I'll use a set of slides in the background so that you can actually see what I'm talking about in the slides. So the this is a flowchart agenda, what I'm going to follow today. I'll start off with the drug pricing problem in the US as it was before MFN and ARA came in, and then explain these two policies and how it's going to impact your product. So let's look at the American pricing situation currently. Americans pay on average 3 times more for branded prescription drugs than people in other developed countries. For some drug categories, that gap is even wider. For small molecules, it's about 8 times the price than comparable countries. And this has been a political lightning rod for years. And the question was never if the government would act, but it was when and how it will act. Well, that has happened now. And it's coming from two directions at once. So, what is MFN pricing? The concept is simple. The US government is saying we are not going to pay more for a drug than other wealthy countries. And in practice, this means tying the American drug prices to an international benchmark, specifically based on prices in the UK, Germany, France, Canada, Japan, and some of the OECD nations. OECD is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, this isn't a brand new idea. The first Trump administration tried to implement MFN back in 2020, but it was blocked by federal courts. This time, what's different is the current Trump administration has taken a multi-pronged approach, combining an executive action from the president's side with voluntary agreements with major manufacturers and 3 new payment models set up through the CMS, the Organization for Medicaid and Medicare. And these models are called Globe, Guard, and Generous. And understanding the differences between them is critical. So let's go through each one of these. So Globe, it stands for Global Benchmark for Efficient Drug Pricing. It targets Medicare Part B drugs, B as in boy, and that B is in there in Globe, so it's easy to remember. These are the medications administered in clinical settings. You can think of cancer therapies, immunotherapies, ophthalmic treatments like intravitreal administration of treatments into the eye. Oncologists and rheumatologists do that, and ophthalmologists do that. So here's how it works. If a US price of a drug exceeds the international benchmark calculated from the reference countries, the manufacturer then owes Medicare a rebate for the difference. And this model is mandatory, launching in October 2026, and will initially cover about 25% of Medicare Part B beneficiaries in randomly selected geographic areas. To qualify, a drug must be a single source product, meaning there shouldn't be any generics or biosimilars. And also, Medicare should have been spending at least $100 million on it annually. Now let's look at GUARD. GUARD stands for Guarding US Medicare Against Rising Drug Costs. And this applies to the Part D equivalent of GLOBE. So and you get the D in GUARD. so it's easy to remember. So it covers retail pharmacy drugs, the medications patients pick up at their local pharmacy. Some basic mechanics work as in Globe. So there's a mandatory rebate that applies when US prices exceed international benchmarks using the same 19 reference countries. Covers drugs in 17 therapeutic categories from analgesics to antivirals to cardiovascular agents. And the spending threshold to trigger this is $69 million of spending annually by Medicare. This launches in January 2027. Now let's look at the generous model. Generous stands for generating cost reductions for US Medicaid. This is for the Medicaid, not Medicare. This one is voluntary for both manufacturers and states. It targets the Medicaid program and uses a slightly different benchmark, the second lowest price from a smaller basket of countries. So the G7 nations plus Denmark and Switzerland. So why would a manufacturer voluntarily participate in this program? Because there are incentives for them. In exchange for offering MFN pricing, they get standardized coverage terms across the participating states. No more negotiating prior authorization criteria with 50 different Medicaid programs. For some companies, this simplification in administration is well worth the price concession. Okay, now then let's look at IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So we were talking about the MFN, most favored nation pricing up until now. Now let's look at the Inflation Reduction Act. Passed in 2022 by the Biden administration, the IRA gave Medicare something it never had before, the authority to negotiate prices directly with drug manufacturers. This is historic because for decades, Medicare was explicitly prohibited from negotiating drug prices, and that's now gone. And here's how it works. The CMS, the Organization for Medicaid and Medicare, selects high expenditure drugs that have been on the market for at least 7 years for small molecules or 11 years for biologics and have no generic or biosimilar competition. Key numbers here, 7 years for small molecules, 11 years for biologics. And for selected drugs, CMS then negotiates a maximum fair price, and manufacturers must accept it or face a tax that starts at 65% of sales and escalates from there on. The first 10 drugs for the IRA were selected in 2023 with negotiated prices taking effect in January 2026, that's last month. Another 15 drugs are being added for 2027, and this will expand over time, and up to 20 new drugs per year are expected to be included in this by 2029. So here's the critical interaction between the MFN and the IRA. So drugs selected for Medicare price negotiation under the IRA are excluded from the Globe and Guard models of the MFN. So if your drug is subjected to a maximum fair price by the IRA, you won't at the same time also face MFN rebate requirements for that product. But there's a catch to it. You might face MFN before you're eligible for either IRA negotiation because that applies as soon as you enter the US market. And I mean, as soon as you then satisfy the other criteria like annual spending, etc. So the IRA negotiation timeline is based on how long the drug has been in the market. So a new biologic could face MFN pricing through Globe for its first 11 years, hypothetically, and then transition to an IRA negotiation after that. So let's look at what all this means in practice. Let's look at impact by drug category. Biologics face the highest exposure, of course. Analysis suggests potential price reductions of 67 to 93% could be applicable without biosimilar competition. Why so dramatic? Because the US international price gap is enormous for these products. Humira, for example, costs nearly 4 times in the US as in the UK. There's an important exemption here. Once a biosimilar enters the US market, both the biosimilar and its reference biologic are excluded from Globe. This creates an interesting dynamic. Originator manufacturers might actually welcome biosimilar competition because it removes them from MFN requirements. Now, with small molecule drugs, they face an even larger proportional price compression. Remember, US prices are about 8 times higher than in the comparison countries for this category of drugs. But small molecules also have a natural exit pathway through generic competition. Once there is generic in the market, the drug is carved out of the MFN. Now, orphan drugs are treated slightly differently. They're in a complex position. So the IRA recently expanded exemptions for orphan drugs from Medicare negotiation. Previously, it used to be for orphan drugs, the exemption used to be for orphan drugs with only one orphan indication, and now that's been expanded to orphan drugs with multiple orphan indications. But there's no explicit orphan drug exemption from global guard under the MFN. So you might escape the IRA negotiation, but still face MFN rebates. And generics are explicitly exempt from all MFN proposals. And this is because the US actually pays less for generics than the comparison countries. It's about 40% lower price for generics in the US market. So there's no policy rationale for applying international reference pricing to generics. Now let's look at the strategic implications of both the MFN and the IRA. For pharma companies, especially international manufacturers considering US market entry, this fundamentally changes the strategic calculus. The old playbook was straightforward. You launch first in the US at premium prices, then sequence down to the other markets. You get the highest price in the US market, then lower price in the other markets. That approach is now problematic. Under MFN, your lowest international price becomes your US price ceiling. And so companies face some hard choices. Do you delay launches in low price reference countries to protect your US benchmark? Some companies are already doing this. External reference pricing has so far been associated with a 73% reduction in the likelihood of drug launch in the US, in other reference countries within 9 months of regulatory approval. It's one strategy. But then you're not unlocking revenues from those markets with the strategy. The other option is to raise international prices outside the US in the reference countries. So Eli Lilly did that in the UK by increasing prices for Mounjaro by 170%, explicitly citing global pricing inconsistencies. But that approach risks these other countries refusing reimbursement. Mounjaro is kind of exempt from this because a big chunk of the sales for Mounjaro is direct to consumer. So that nice guidance doesn't apply there. So, or do you accept lower US prices from the outset? That's another strategy. And restructure your global pricing architecture based on that. So that may actually be beneficial for some companies if they want to preserve total revenue and total value of the product. But there's no easy answer. The days of treating each market's price in isolation are over. So you need to look at all of these prices together now. So where does this leave us? MFN pricing and the Inflation Reduction Act represent the most significant structural changes to US drug pricing in decades. They're not independent policies. They interact in complex ways with different timelines, different mechanisms, and different exemptions. So the pharma companies, for them, the message is clear. A global pricing strategy is no longer optional, but essential. A pricing decision in Germany or Japan now directly impacts what you can charge in the United States. The walls between the markets have come down. So whether you view this as a long overdue reform or as a threat to innovation, depending on which side of the fence you sit in, there's one thing that is certain. The era of treating the US as a pricing free-for-all market has ended. So if you need support with coming up with a global pricing strategy, taking into consideration the overall revenues that can be tapped from a new product launch, and also to preserve the maximum value for the product in the process, you can approach us. We'll help you deal with that. We'll set up the right global pricing strategy for you. Just message us and we'll be in touch with you. So thank you for listening to this podcast. Hope this is helping you. And bye for now. We are done with this podcast.